Welcome back to the Oxford University Scientific Society in Trinity Term 2021. I hope everyone has enjoyed their Easter vacation and all the best of luck for the term ahead. To start off the new term, we thought we would change up the format of the event a little, and this is the reason why we're conducting an extended interview with our guest speaker today, Professor Richard Barker. Professor Barker has a broad range of expertise from working at the interface between academia and industry in medicine and healthcare. We look forward to hearing some of his insights today. As per the usual format, please do put your questions in the comment section as they come up, and we'll try to integrate them when the relevant contexts come up. So, without further ado, let's bring on our speaker. Good afternoon, Professor, and Carlos. Carlos will be doing the interview with me today, and he is the Vice President of the Science Society. Okay, so before we begin the interview properly, would you mind telling us a little about yourself, your career, and perhaps something about your current interests or projects that you're working on?
Happy to, and thank you very much for the invitation, Luna, Carlos. Thank you also for not demanding that I make a 35 PowerPoint slide PowerPoint presentation. Which is really good for me and probably a lot better for you too. So I've had a long and quite varied career. It started actually in Oxford, where I did my undergraduate in chemistry and my DPhil in, I guess it's biophysics. There wasn't a department of biophysics, but between chemistry and biochemistry on the behavior of lipid membranes, actually using nuclear magnetic resonance. But since that time, I did a couple of postdocs, but since that time, I've largely been involved in business activities. So I have run IBM's healthcare business. I have been the manager of a large diagnostics business. I was the Director General of the Pharmaceutical Industry Association in the UK. I was on the board of a very large pharma company for about 7 years. And since I stopped doing full-time activities, I've been a bit more entrepreneurial. I do some work in the NHS. I chair something called the Health Innovation Network. But I have a number of companies that I've helped start. One called Metadvice, applying artificial intelligence to medicine. One, InnoHealth, taking biological molecules from Europe to China, and another one applying AI to creative problem solving. So I guess I've had a fairly varied career, and I'm still doing a reasonably unusual mix of things.
Wow, that sounds like quite the broad range of different expertise you have. Anything that you're working on right now at the minute? Is it just helping these companies, or anything in particular you would like to explore more?
Well, I'd like to just say a word about Metadvice, which is applying AI to clinical decision making in two different ways. Offline, trying to figure out from electronic medical records exactly how you can distinguish one type of patient from another. One of my passions is precision medicine. So how do we tune what we give individual patients according to not just their genetic backgrounds, but how their health records reveal the trajectory they're on as individuals. And then we're also applying it online, giving the doctors an interface they can look at that embeds the clinical guidelines that all doctors should follow, but also increasingly shows them the personal characteristics of a particular patient and what the system would recommend that the doctor consider. And so I've always liked working at the bleeding edge, if I can put it that way, of technology, and AI is certainly one of those bleeding edges at the moment.
Right, we'll definitely come back to that later. But before we go on to the conversation about AI in medicine, I would like to ask, well, you can guess, about the pandemic. So we all know this pandemic's been raging outside for more than over a year now, and it's looking like everything is coming back to normal, or at least by the end of this year. So my first question is, it's more than clear that the recent pandemic has changed how everyone sees the world. What did it mean for the healthcare sector and the patients, I presume, since you say you chaired some NHS boards?
Yeah, so the first thing to say is it's not subsiding at all globally. It's taking off like a rocket in India. It's
That's true.
still burning through people's families in Brazil and many parts of the world. So I think we need to be sure that we don't take too insular an approach to this. But you're quite right, things are quietening down a bit in the UK, which because of the vaccination program, I think is more advanced, certainly than most European countries, and except for Israel, if you regard that as European. What does it mean for the healthcare sector? Well, looking on the positive side, it has demonstrated we can bring innovations through the pipeline much faster than we ever thought possible. So it often takes 10 years from the identification of a virus to the creation of a vaccine that is effective. We did that in 10 months. I mean, it's just remarkable. And not just once, we've produced a whole host of vaccines with different mechanisms. So bringing technology to the patient quickly and deploying it quickly, we've learned how to do that as never before, if you like. On the sort of revelatory side, if I can put it that way, it has exposed how poorly we are serving certain populations. So as everybody will have read, you know, health inequalities really have been exposed by the whole process of the pandemic. People from the Black, Asian, Middle Eastern communities have been severely affected. People with obesity, with diabetes, with a few other chronic conditions have been more likely to die. So it's been like a searchlight, really, in a way that was picked out the problems that ought to have been solved by preventative healthcare, by public health or preventative health, and haven't. And so unfortunately the virus, as it's gone across the population, has really exposed those areas of weakness. I do have a research program on personal health resilience, which was really inspired by that. Without personal health resilience, we're all subject to whatever next comes along, either in terms of a health shock to us as individuals or a pandemic such as this. The other thing I would say is that the pandemic has really exposed how well certain systems have done certain things in one part of the world or another, whether it's testing, whether it's tracing, whether it's vaccination. I mean, countries have been very different in the way they've approached many of these things. And we will have, I think if anybody wants to do a PhD, there'll be hundreds of PhDs that could be written about the pandemic.
That's very true. Do you reckon there's a better strategy, or is there a strategy that worked better, even in just in terms of testing or vaccinating? Is there something that has been done right?
Well, we've done a pretty good job in the UK in vaccination, but we did a lousy job in the first year in testing. So as you mentioned, I'm involved with the NHS, and I remember saying to everybody who would listen right at the beginning, February of last year, it's going to be about testing capacity. That's what we need to build up. And we were very slow to build up testing capacity. We finally have done so, I think, more or less now. We've done vaccination well, and we've done testing pretty poorly. The other thing that I think is very interesting to study, and I'm not sure how easy it is to change, is different national characteristics. The way in which some people behave. This has been an unusual thing, right? I mean, there's not been many cases in human history where the people who spread something are not the people who ultimately will suffer from it. And so we've had lots of super spreader events amongst younger people who are completely oblivious because they either have no symptoms or they know they're pretty immune to the seriousness of the disease, but then it gets spread through their families, and their aunts, their uncles, their grandparents die. And there are not many health situations that are like that, because usually you're telling somebody, well, don't do this because you'll have a problem. We've had to say to people, don't do this because they will have a problem. And morally and ethically, it's a very different situation.
That's really interesting to hear. Do you reckon anything could be done about the situation? Is it to do with people trusting what's been told to them and actually following instructions, or is it something more deep rooted?
Well, this is where I think everybody's opinion is worth about the same. So I'll give you my opinion.
All right.
I think we depended too much in our country, indeed most countries, on telling people what to do. And we spent too little time educating them about the risks and allowing them to use their common sense. Right. So, you know, is it 1 meter or is it 2 meters or is it 3 meters? You know, do you wear a face mask under these circumstances or those circumstances? And telling people what to do only takes you so far. So I was having a conversation with somebody from India earlier today. And as we've just said, they're having a terrible time of it because they are not good at social distancing. They had a pretty good phase one. Their phase one was quite low, and it gave them too much confidence. So as soon as they had a variant of the virus that was easily transmissible, they continued to behave the way they did in the first wave, which is families got together and breathed the same air for hours on end. And I heard of a family that had 4 or 5 people die. Largely because they had congregated together and breathed the same air for a long period of time, and the person who was infected everybody else. So it's a very interesting human behavioral problem. Is there a solution to that human behavioral problem? I think there are some simple rules that you can give people, but fundamentally you have to teach them. It was a long time before we said, you know, this virus can be spread by asymptomatic people. Mm-hmm. Very long time. I mean, you remember all those months in the UK where we only offered tests to people with symptoms, as if it was only people with symptoms that could spread the virus. Whereas, in fact, a lot of the spreading was between people who had no symptoms at all and never had symptoms. So anyway, one could talk about the virus. I'm sure you have conversations every morning about the latest news about coronavirus. That might be enough.
Well, I would just like to quickly conclude this section on the pandemic by asking you, you know, what kind of lasting influence do you think this whole having been through all of these will have to us as, you know, people, or to governments, or perhaps to the healthcare industry?
Big question, right? So I've already said I think we've learned how to innovate faster. So hopefully we will hold to that. Yes. We have learned the power of data and how data should be shared. So I was talking to a professor of Liverpool earlier this afternoon, and Liverpool have done a wonderful job of linking together the hospital data, the primary care data, the social care data, all of the different data streams, because there was a crisis to manage. And so it's taught us how in extremists, if you like, the sharing of data is an extremely valuable thing and actually a possible thing. Nobody objected to it because they could see it was saving lives. So I think we'll take that with us. Clearly, just as this demonstrated, I mean, the last time I spoke to this society, it was in a lecture hall with people in rows. We have learned how to do the best we can digitally, whether it's ordering stuff for home or whether it's having meetings like this. We have it's kick-started our digital lives to a tremendous extent. I mean, most of my days are full of Zoom calls, team calls, which is a bit, in a sense, it's deceptive because you think you're getting your point across, you think you're meeting somebody, but you're not actually. Turns out I hired a chief executive I've never met for an organization that I chair. That's a strange experience.
That's a strange feeling, isn't it?
Looking forward maybe next week or the week after meeting this individual. But I sort of feel I know them, but do I really? You know, that kind of thing. But we have learned to transfer our lives to a digital plane much faster than we would otherwise have done.
That's very true. I don't think we're going to be able to ever deal without Zoom meetings now. Now that people realize it's so much easier to, you know, actually organize them and just get people onto the same call. Carlos, anything to add about the pandemic?
No, I think we can finish the pandemic block in here. And I'm very, very excited to continue on to the next block, which is about AI and big data in medicine.
Yes.
So if you don't mind that I start asking you, what is sort of your view on the field as a whole? What is the big picture about digital medicine or precision medicine, or how to use data for good?
Just a quick intro would be very good.
Who's quick intro? Oh, you mean about digital health?
Yes, just in general.
Yeah, so digital
view.
health is we won't talk about it as digital health in 10 to 15 years. It will just be medicine, right? And we'll just be using digital information the way we've used all kinds of information. We'll use digital media in the way we've used all kinds of media. But it will have enabled us to move certain things online that were formerly offline, right? So one of the big things that I haven't mentioned so far, but everybody will know about it, is the move to online consultations. So whether you're consulting with your GP or a specialist in hospital, much of that can be done online and will continue to be done online. Why would you? And it will make scheduling and so much easier for everybody. So we're going to have a plethora of digital health applications. We already have an enormous number of apps that you can put on your phone. And that'll become, normal life for all of us over the next 10 or 15 years. The thing that particularly interests me are the applications of artificial intelligence, because in principle, artificial intelligence can juggle with that many more parameters than most humans can. I mean, it's said that doctors can sort of think about 5 things at once when they're dealing with a patient. There's no limit to how many parameters an AI program can take into account when trying to optimize their clinical decision making. Where it's had the first impact is very much in image recognition, whether we're talking about CT scans or scans of the back of the eye or whatever. The machine learning is better now, actually. It's not popular to say so, but it's better than most human beings because it's learned on an enormous data set and therefore can be more experienced, so to speak, than any living radiographer, for example. The second thing is optimization. So it's pretty good at optimizing resource allocation. Where to send ambulances and all of that kind of thing. Where I'm particularly interested is applying it to clinical decision making, which I think is relatively new. We're beginning to see it in cancer, being able to create precision medicine targeting for cancer therapy. But I think that too, in 10, 15 years time, we won't talk about it as AI as if it's this thing over here. It'll be embedded in everything we do. Before you ask the question, Carlos, I have to say this. I'm very, I believe the singularity is coming, but the only approach to the singularity is that we build all of this with human-machine interaction. And we never give the machine a task to go away and do. We say, here's the human being with the human problem, here's the machine and its capabilities, and it's about dialogue and it's about partnership between human and machine. Otherwise, the machines will indeed run. I can imagine after the singularity what this evening's discussion will be like. I probably won't be here, but neither of you might be here either. It might be three different machines discussing, whether in fact Oxford University is actually necessary, right? So
let's hope they keep that if we do come to it.
I'm a great believer in human-machine partnership when it comes to AI. I think I probably got off the point there a little bit. You better ask your next question.
How much do we trust these AIs, especially when given, they're given these really confidential data? Doctors, they're not the most, well, I guess they have to be quite careful with what kind of decisions they make. So, there are ultimately some code out there that's doing all the decision making. It feels different to, relying on a human being. What's your take on that?
Well, for a very long time, we will still rely on the human being. As I say, the human being will use the AI tool, but will ultimately come to their own conclusion. And I think if you are just facing an AI black box and it is deciding exactly what you have and how you should be treated, I don't think you'll feel very comfortable. At least I wouldn't feel very comfortable.
That's true.
So I think that will, for a very long time, it'll still be a personal decision by a personal clinician assisted by the AI. But you raised the question of confidentiality. Even if we didn't have AI, digital health raises the question of confidentiality. And so I think the UK has done a pretty good job putting information governance in place to make sure that confidential health information doesn't get shared with the wrong people. In fact, some days I think it's done too good a job, because it's actually quite hard to get access to patient level data, even if it's de-identified or anonymized. But I think we've done a pretty good job. I don't think it'll have been the same in every other country in the world. So confidentiality of data is going to be extremely important. But my point is, I don't think it's the existence of AI that makes that important. It's the existence of any digital media.
But what about sort of companies exploiting data that's confidential to build their AIs? Because I assume a lot of this development is not going to be public. So like at some point that data has to be taken outside of the NHS data vault and given to companies that will exploit it.
Well, if you take the company that I founded, as an example, Carlos, we never want identifiable data. We say we never want it, because we never propose to go back to that patient and try and sell them anything. You know, we want patient level data, but de-identified data. And I think that's probably going to be required almost everywhere. I mean, I can't speak for China or Russia or whatever, but I think in most of the developed world, we're going to have some pretty hard and fast rules about that. You raise, I think, by implication, an interesting question, which is, suppose an AI-based company discovers something using your data, my data, Luna's data. You know, how should the value be distributed? Should the company run away with all the value? Well, I don't think they'll be allowed to. I think I mean, again, the company that I founded, there has to be a value exchange. It could be money, but it could also be free use of the software for a period of time. I think the most challenging question is, how does value get back to the patient? Well, I think value will get back to the patient usually by better care in the future. Complex problem though.
Actually, I want to chip in quickly here. Since we're using these patient data from patients, what does it actually mean for the entire industry? You know, before, in the state of not having access to all this data, and in the state of having access to all this data, what difference does it actually make?
Well, I think you'd have to be more specific about the kind of company you're talking about.
I think it'll probably be some kind of either health sciences or whatever, drug discovery kind of data, or I'm sure that you are far more knowledgeable in this area than I am.
No, you already listed a few things. So drug discovery, right? It's important that we learn all we can from the way in which patients have been treated in the past in order to discover new targets for drugs. So I'm on the board of a company that is matching up genetic data with electronic medical record data to say which subgroups of patients with certain genetic traits appear to be either resistant to this drug or likely to suffer from this disease. I think that's an extremely important stream of value going into drug discovery. When you come down to you know, the use of already developed drugs on actual populations, then I think there's a lot of scope to be able to make sure that the right patient is given the right drug at the right time and so on. So I think it does depend a little bit on the nature of the company and the way in which they're using the data.
That's fair enough. I think it does vary depending on what the company would like to do with all the data available. And I'm sure there's a lot that could be done. So I think I will chip into one of the questions that's from our audience and ask, what do you think is the most important issue, or, you know, the challenge facing these kind of using AI in medicine to generate more information and to develop our technology further? What's the main hurdle? What's stopping us?
So I think we're probably touching on it now, which is responsible and effective data access. And when I say responsible, I think we've touched on that. How do you make sure the data isn't falling into the wrong hands in an identifiable way? and that value is exchanged between the companies that have access to the data and the health systems that provide it one way or another. So I think that is the biggest challenge, data access, but there are clearly ethical challenges that we're talking about. I mean, we've already discovered in other spheres that AI can be biased by the way in which doctors have made decisions, right? And so if you train AI on the wrong data set, you will simply replicate the human biases that exist. I mean, the flip side of that is, in principle, if they're given a fully balanced data, then you won't have the kind of thing that's happening. I've discovered that, you know, the level of stillborn babies in black families is worse than in white families, but it's better if black doctors are serving the population than white doctors. I mean, there's obviously a lot of racial factors that in the way in which the human world works, that in principle the AI world could not, should not suffer from. But if it's simply trained on what has happened in the past, as opposed to the intrinsic capabilities of people, then there's a risk that it will simply replicate the biases of the past.
Really interesting. So let me chip in with a related question into this. So many AI algorithms are based on a balance between exploration and exploitation. So they try to learn from the things that they have seen and explore new things that they haven't. So what is the danger of this? I imagine what will happen, or is it good if an AI algorithm experiments beyond the data it's been trained of, and may do things that are potentially very beneficial for patients, but also potentially very harmful?
Well, I think the first line of defense is what I covered before, which is ultimately it will be a human physician for a very long time that will actually execute this. And so actually we were talking about this in the company I mentioned earlier today. You know, how do you record the fact that a doctor has decided to ignore the recommendation that the AI has given them, right? We were actually talking about, should you ask did you accept or reject the recommendation? We decided that that's probably not good language. Did it help you or not? Is better language. Was it relevant to this patient or not? Is even better language. So we've got to script, so to speak, the dialogue between the machine and the human in the right sort of way. I mean, the exciting thing about AI is we're really in the foothills here. And so that question, like many other questions, we're just grappling with now when it comes to decision making. It doesn't really apply to some of the early applications that we've all read about. Nobody is saying, you know, is the machine that is reading back of the eye scans getting it right or wrong, because it's been trained on millions of scans and it's almost certainly getting it right. In fact, it turns out, I don't know whether you know this, but somebody from Moorfields was telling me the AI can tell a male from a female back of the eye scan. You show these to a human ophthalmologist and they can't. But the AI program is so subtle that not that you go to an AI exam to determine whether you're male or female, but it's an example of how the AI program can see things that humans can't. So I don't worry about that. I think I worry more about some of the areas we've just been talking about, which is the interplay between human intelligence, machine intelligence, and patients. And of course, ultimately, the patients will be the recipients of AI as well. Ideally, the AI assisted programs will be feeding into the patient the behaviors that they can display that will help them with their disease.
I think that actually leads me to think about whether, literacy about digital applications, whether we need to actually tell doctors and patients or just society in general about, how exactly do these things work? Should something be done about that? It feels necessary if they're going to be, eventually benefiting or being harmed by these things, they can be affected.
It's an absolutely huge question. I remember being at the office of the founder of DeepMind, which some of you will have heard about. And he was furious because there had been a program, there had been a magazine article about DeepMind. This was a few years ago. And he showed me the Terminator, the robot. There is this sort of identification in the public mind between artificial intelligence and Arnold Schwarzenegger, I think it was, as the Terminator. In other words, it's ruthless, it's evil, it's unstoppable, all of those things. And so I think, Luna, you've got your finger on a really important point, which is how we educate the public. And we better do that before they see how AI is actually helping. Or they'll turn against it. I mean, you remember genetically modified foods is another example, where in Europe everybody turned against genetically modified foods on the basis of some newspaper campaigns that said, well, it was, what was it, Frankenfoods was the phrase. This is a few years ago now. But if we're not careful, a similar sort of phenomenon will surround AI and not slow it down. So the public education at every level about what AI is and what it isn't, what it can do and what it can't, absolutely critical.
So how do we propose is a good way to go about, telling the public what AI can and cannot do?
It's interesting because, all these discussions ultimately come down to education. And we're saying, we need to teach all our children to code. Well, that's probably a good idea. There's nothing wrong with coding, although we don't need a whole population full of coders. Because I think Oxford now has an AI company that writes code that can write code. So, what's that about? we may not need coders, but we really do need to start right at the earliest stages, educating children about just what I said before, what AI is, what it isn't, how it can help, and what you shouldn't get it to do. And so that there's a societal understanding. I mean, take climate change, for example. Over the last 10 years, we've gone from climate change being the enthusiasms of a relatively few people to a general acceptance that A, it's a problem, B, we better do something about it. And so it does take 10 or 20 years usually from the recognition that society needs to grapple with something and actually, that being widespread in the population. And often the children lead it, right? They certainly, Greta Thunberg has led it in climate change. So we probably need some young advocates and educators in AI.
Well, Carlos is actually doing some AI in his PhD, so I'm guessing he'll have more to comment on it than I do. Do you reckon it's possible to teach kids? Is it a good idea about coding? Because I certainly don't know much about coding, and I have to admit that's probably I should probably go and pick up some of that. It'll be a good idea. So what's your experience with coding? Is it something that people should be scared of? Presumably not.
I mean, you're asking me. I do teach programming here at Oxford and for students, and like that's something that I think we should ask Professor Barker, because it is very related to what we were talking about before in terms of different national approaches to things. Like I know in some countries, for example, in Japan, in some places, programming is a subject at high school. So do you think that's what we should do? Should we get children since, say, 4th grade start writing code?
I can't see there's any harm in it. I mean, it's basic logic, right? It's a language, after all, like all languages that we learn. I haven't done coding for an extremely long time, and some of the most sophisticated programs like TensorFlow, which you all know about in AI, are now public domain, so you don't actually have to write the underlying code. You can use modules that are publicly available. So I think how teaching kids what's out there and how best to exploit it, take advantage of it, is what we need to do. I don't think we should have hours and hours of coding. And I don't know what point. Let me ask you this, Carlos. If you had to have your time again, when would you want to have started to learn to code?
I think shortly after I learned to write, probably. I wish I had learned it much sooner in my life, not to say my career.
And I think you're right. I mean, well, sorry, you're much more expert on this than I am, but I suspect the earlier, so it's like foreign languages. The earlier you teach them, the more readily somebody will take it up.
This is interesting. Just coming back on track about the medical field, imagine a future where all the science researchers somehow at least know a little bit about scientific computing. What could we do in that case that we couldn't do now?
I think pretty much everything, right? So if you look at the whole process, I mean, I spent a lot of time in my career in pharmaceuticals. Almost every step, all the way from we discussed it before, what genes and what proteins do we want to target in the drug discovery, all the way through to how would doctors like to get the messages from companies about what drugs do. I mean, we've currently got this slightly crazy situation where we put young graduates in cars, and they drive to the doctor's office and try and get 4 or 5 minutes with them to pitch them on what the drug is. I mean, we can probably improve on that, particularly post-COVID, where it wasn't even possible. So all the way through the chain of events, from discovering something all the way through to educating people about what it does, I think there's the potential for digital interventions and digital codes, if you like. So it'll transform pretty much everything, I think, if we're open to it.
Will it make the whole process much more efficient? Is that where most of the benefit will come from, or something else?
And effective, efficient and effective. I remember, relevant to this, a visit to a lab when I was on the board at Celgene in Seattle, and the fellow was taking us around. They said, well, when we designed this lab, over here was the wet lab where we were going to do experiments, and over here was the silicon-based, if you like, the computing area. And so we had to completely change, because most of the time people needed to be at a machine, manipulating concepts and molecules on a machine, and the amount of time they needed to spend in the lab actually turning that into wet experiments was much smaller. So that's just one example, I think, of how the digital world is going to completely revolutionize every step of the process. I'm particularly interested in the idea of digital twins, which I guess some of you will have heard about. So this idea of creating a computer model of something, and therefore being able to do in silico experiments about it. I mean, I'm enthusiastic about creating a digital twin of the London population. So you could do, so to speak, if you had an idea of a new health policy, you could play it through in a model, and model the different groups who are going to be affected in different ways, rather than say, well, with a Secretary of State bouncing out of bed saying, I think we should do this, let's do it. And then, 5-10 years later, oh, it didn't work, So the idea of creating digital twins, whether they're of bodies or of populations, or of cities for that matter, there's a lot of work on the digital twinning of cities. All of this is possible. It's all very exciting.
But then that begs the question, how do we know whether the twin is actually, a good copy of what happens in real life? Because after all, you're trying to make future predictions about what's going to happen. And imagine a London population, what if you do something to them? I mean, even if you ask the most wise of all people, it's kind of difficult to tell what exactly is going to happen. So how do we even go about doing something like that? Do we just base it off past experiences, or do we do something else?
Well, you're reminding me of the quote that I put at the front of the research proposal about digital twins of populations. It was, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so my argument is not that I can predict exactly how the London population would respond to a particular well, take the pandemic, a particular way of dealing with the pandemic. But it's much better to play these things through in a computer first. And you're much more likely, I think, to see all of the factors because you'll have to program them in than trying it in real life on a population and discovering you're wrong.
Carlos, anything to add here?
Not really. I have a bunch of other questions to ask in related topics, but not at the moment, no.
Oh, well, go ahead and start with one of that.
Okay, so I think I'm gonna ask one last question in sort of the AI big data thing, and maybe we can then move to more medicine related innovation. So I wanted to ask your opinion in terms of computers as means of production. So if you follow the AI literature in the past couple of years, like all of the big advances, GPT-3 and things like that, have used like millions and millions and millions of dollars in compute power. So are we gonna move towards a model where, in a way, compute power is gonna be like the means of production, and then only the people that have access to massive infrastructure like Google and Amazon or Facebook are gonna be able to do something, while small companies are just gonna have to do whatever is possible instead of whatever they want?
And I think underlying your question is also different groups of society, different nations that have. Now, I'm afraid you're probably right. By the way, I was talking to somebody about GPT-3 earlier today, and he said nobody understands how it works. Somebody sent me a piece of text that GPT-3 had produced, but nobody knows exactly how the program chose those phrases and put them together in those sentences in the way that it did. So I'm afraid there is a digital divide at various levels. I mean, we talk about it with regard to all the way down to individuals, whether they have smartphones or not. But if you don't have access to significant compute power, I mean, the saving grace, so to speak, is that it's still getting cheaper and cheaper year on year. I mean, there might be some physical limit to Moore's law, but we haven't reached it yet. And as we go to quantum computing, the ability to be able to create massive computer power at affordable cost. And actually, I don't know whether the compute power and compute efficiency is keeping pace with what we're trying to do. You know, some of you might be playing around in the Bitcoin arena. You know, it may be that they will take up all of the compute power in the world before anybody else has the chance to use it. Now, you ask an extremely good question, which frankly I don't know the answer to, but it's very clear that access to computing power is going to be, in the world that we're talking about, a massive resource that some societies will have to a greater extent than others. The other question you're sort of asking is, are the Googles and Amazons, Microsofts and Facebooks of the world going to conquer all heights because of their access to massive computer power? I don't think so, because of the rather narrow view they take of what world problems look like. I think there's going to be plenty of space for creative people who are listening to this, creative people, you know, going through Oxford or whatever, to create companies, to create ventures, to do research that's not dependent on any of those companies, and will still change the world. Which is another way of saying you don't all have to go away and work for Google.
I was more in the line of like, are you scared that Google to some step will try to scoop your company's work, for example, or should any sort of early stage AI and biomedical science company be afraid of competition for the big tech?
Well, I used to work for a company called IBM, right? And they created Watson, and they were very proud of it. And it sort of grew after I left the company. So, but it actually has not conquered the world of medicine because of the way they went about it. I'm not trying to decry it. I'm sure it's doing some useful things in some parts of the world's healthcare system. I think these large companies sometimes can't get out of their own way, if I can put it that way. To Google, everything looks like a search, so to speak. And I think that a lot of their ventures have yet to show real power in the world. So the fact that you're very big and very rich doesn't guarantee success if you view the world in too narrow a way. So I think there's plenty of opportunity for small companies. I mean, they might well get bought up by these large companies, but you know, that's for the future.
Yes, I suppose if you have a hammer, everything to the nail, the classic proverb. Moving on to the next section of the interview, since you've really worked a lot in the pharma and biotech industry and innovation, I just would like to ask, to get the conversation started, what are some of the revolutionary technologies you have seen in your career, and how have they changed the landscape?
So, where to start? It's a very big question. So, if we start with pharmaceuticals, with therapies, if you like, I've been able to see the transition from largely chemical drugs to biological drugs, from largely biological drugs to cell-based therapies and gene-based therapies, and now I think there's something like 300 different gene therapies in the pipeline around the world. You've got these CAR T therapies, which are genetically modified T cells that can be programmed to attack particular cancers. So in terms of sophistication, there's been an enormous change in what we would regard as a therapeutic. If you go to diagnostics, for example, go back 20, 30 years, everybody had the same 20 blood tests run, but that was about all. Now, ideally, a clinician might want to see the whole genome sequence of somebody before deciding how best to treat them. Certainly, before recognizing certain rare diseases, inherited diseases, you do want the full genome, not just the exome. You want the full genome, because some of them are expression errors. So it's been an enormous set of changes, and we've talked a little bit, probably best not to go back to it, but digital things. One thing that hasn't moved very fast is the electronic medical record. There have been companies that have created these and spread them around, but there's still a tremendous amount of work to be done, making them more human compatible and making them more attractive for doctors and nurses and clinicians to use. And that's one of the things that I'm working on with Metadvice, making it more intuitive and more accessible, as opposed to being just a way of collecting and delivering data.
Right. Well, connected question then. What do you reckon are the future trends we should look out for in the next 10 or 20 years in this medical innovation space?
Well, gene editing will be important, right? We're beginning to see therapies based on gene editing. I've already mentioned gene therapies themselves, just implanting a gene that is missing or defective into a patient. There's going to be a very interesting wave of innovation to do with healthy longevity. There's some very interesting people in Oxford. Lynn Cox, for example, some of you may know Professor Lynn Cox, is working on senolytics, which are agents to kill senescent cells, because it turns out as you get older, there are more and more cells build up in the body that basically have checked out but haven't really left. And some of them turn into cancerous cells, so you want to get rid of that. But basically, a lot of the signs of old or of increasing age and poorer personal productivity is a result of these senescent cells. So that's just one example of a mechanism that we're going to explore in terms of human healthy longevity. The problem, by the way, with longevity is age and aging is not recognized as a disease. So there's quite a lot of debate about whether you can or should treat aging as a disease that should be treated, because we're all kind of programmed to think of aging as a natural process, and why would you want to get in the way of it? But certainly most people would rather live healthily and vigorously until the age of 100 and then drop dead, rather than to go through this period of slow decline that sadly most people, or a very large number of people, go to. That if you could intervene to stop that, you don't have to increase somebody's actual lifespan, but if you can increase their healthy lifespan, you know, that's tremendously valuable. I led a population health group with the all-party parliamentary group on healthy longevity about a year and a half ago, and they published a report called The Health of the Nation. And the government, the UK government, is still committed to an increase of 5 years in healthy lifespan by the year 2035. Hasn't figured out how to do it, but it's a really important target, because if you think about all the long-term conditions that bedevil you in the second half of your life, if you could postpone or eliminate those, it would be great for people's lives and their lifestyle. It would even be greater for the NHS and the healthcare system.
I mean, I think we're coming to agree on the fact that there are these age-related diseases, despite age itself might not be seen as a disease per se, but there are all these diseases that are more likely to happen in older people, whether it be atherosclerosis, being cancer, or neurodegeneration, all these different things, which actually does a lot of damage if we just think about the whole aging population we have. And I think if we can somehow solve these problems, or at least, you know, make it a bit easier for these patients, it will do a huge deal of difference. It will change a lot of things, and it will be wonderful to have these kind of advancements, to see these happening. So what do you reckon we should do to allow such advances in this field, to allow us to treat this disease better, or whatever, whether it being from the medical expertise, or from the government, or from just the entrepreneurship in general?
There's a scientific problem to solve, and it's the biomarkers of aging. And we know some of them now. The epigenetic clock is one example. But if we could measure easily and cheaply how your body is aging, and you could link it to your behavior, you know, what you eat, how much you drink, what exercise you take, whether you take your pills for this, that, and the other. If you could build a feedback loop for people so that they knew before they were ever sick with anything, whether they were in fact maintaining their healthy status, their homeostasis, if you like, then that would do a tremendous amount. But we don't really have those yet. We've got tests for the epigenome that cost about £300 or £400. Yeah, I think there's an Oxford-based company that does them, but they're all over the world. So you can send your blood off and they'll do it for you. But that's not going to be the sort of thing that's going to be the daily life of everybody. We need a way that, you know, your Fitbit or your Apple Watch or something can take a set of measurements, and you say, oh yeah, I've done my 10,000 steps every day for the last week, and look, you know, I've aged less. If you could get that kind of, at the moment we have this intrinsic belief that if I do more exercise, I eat less fatty or sugary foods, then that's going to be good for me. But it would be great, particularly when you're getting into the middle years, where you've got lots of other things in your mind, and you don't go to the gym every day, or I don't know whether you folks do, but you know, you're probably young and healthy as it is. But as you go into your middle years, the kinds of things you do or don't do with your body will have an enormous effect on your healthy lifespan, but you haven't got a way of measuring it.
I think it will always be helpful for the clinician to have a way to see a benchmark of some sort to measure how aging, or just other things in general, you know, predict how likely someone's going to have a disease. It'll be a very useful thing to have, even just for experimental, you know, coming up with good experimental models, or actually being able to see how well drugs work. And linking from that point on, I just would like to ask, what do you see are the biggest opportunities for UK or just global life science companies in the coming years? What do you reckon that the UK will play as a country in, you know, somehow coming up with better disease treatments, or innovating in whatever sense in this medical field?
I think the UK has become quite good at what's called regenerative medicine, the cell and gene therapies, for its size. It can't be compared in terms of the numbers of companies and the power of the companies with the US. But I think it's doing a pretty good job. It's also been investing a bit in biologicals manufacture, the manufacture of those and other more sophisticated drugs. I think it is setting itself to be quite a leader in AI. Whether it's going to, outstrip China and the US, I don't know. You ask a very wide question. I think a country like the UK does need to be a bit focused. It can't seek, we're very proud of ourselves too often, and we think we can lead in everything we can't. So we need to be a little bit more focused in what we decide we're going to be leaders in. Am I allowed to drink water, Carlos, as well? I'm sort
yes, of course. Please feel free.
The things that help you.
People this morning asked me if I was drinking vodka, but it's water.
Oh dear.
Would you mind if I just chip in and sort of?
Oh, go ahead, absolutely. Go.
So actually, this brings me back to sort of the really vaccine nationalism and other things that we talk about in the first part of the interview about different countries having different resources and different capacities. For example, now to build vaccines. So, do you think there is, in a way, also strategic importance for the countries to be able to acquire more capacity, sort of all around, instead of focusing, as you just recommended the UK to do? So, like, imagine that the next pandemic can only be cured with, I don't know, gene therapy, say. Shouldn't the UK also invest there?
Well, yeah, you're asking whether your fundamental question is, can a nation be self-sufficient in the technologies required to deal with something like a pandemic? And my answer is no. We have to wire the system together so that people can trade across nations the various elements of a vaccine or whatever. You probably realize that certain raw materials that have to go into the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine come out of the UK, they go into Europe, they get incorporated with something else, get shipped back. That's how we built the life sciences industry. I think it would be a retrograde step if national governments said, we've got to be self-sufficient. It's an almost impossible task for anybody, I would say, except America and China, in terms of the resources they have. And so it's in the interest of the rest of us that these countries don't, in fact, try and hoard those resources to themselves. There'll be a bit of that. I mean, it's natural. It's important, I think, for governments to know where products are coming from, get a bit more transparency on what's called the supply chain, and the elements that make up something, because you don't want to be caught out by being, very dependent on something that doesn't appear because of a problem, in some factory in China or whatever it is. So there needs to be more transparency, but I think the life sciences economy needs to be a genuinely global one.
I would like to just ask a quick question, tagging on to that. Not only just resources, what about, people? People is a kind of resource, I suppose. So what do you suppose that collaborations would do? With a good thing, like between countries just globally in general, would do to the life sciences industry in the next few years, 10 years in the future in general?
Well, there's massive collaboration at an academic level. I think we took a step back. Don't want to get into politics, but leaving the Erasmus scheme, but the interchange of people. I mean, I did one of my postdocs in Germany. The interchange of people at an academic level is vital. When you're building a small company, I'm building a small company. It's difficult to be very collaborative in every country you're operating in. And it's easiest to refine your technology in one country and then, so to speak, export it. But collaboration is absolutely essential in life sciences, all the way through from academia to product distribution.
Okay, I'm very conscious of the time. So, Carlos, do you have anything to add? If not, we'll conclude with one last question.
Okay, well, if I have the privilege to ask the last question, then I will say, if you were to give one piece of advice to any of our audience, or Luna or myself, about pursuing a career in medicine, pharmacy, or AI, what would you advise?
I think the first piece of advice is probably unnecessary, but I still remember when I left the lab to go and work in quotes, industry, somebody who was working in that same lab implied I was somehow or other selling out. And that stayed with me all that time. Selling out intellectually, I think, rather than morally, but selling out. So recognize that high quality work is being done everywhere. It's being done in academia, it's being done in small companies, it's being done in large companies. So don't be prejudiced about where you work. Look ahead and say, what's in 10 years' time? What are the problems the world's going to be grappling with? And work back from that to the technologies and innovations that are going to be needed to address those problems, rather than just working forward from the technologies you happen to have in front of you. Because that ability to be able to, I call it right to left thinking, not just left to right thinking, working back from the big problems people are going to pay to have solved, rather than just saying, I've got this really cool idea, I'm sure somebody will want to buy it. I did a piece of work quite a long time ago now, actually, for the Prince of Wales, of all people, on British innovation versus American innovation and so on. And I came to the conclusion that you have to think in parallel rather than in series, about three questions. Does this technology work? Is there a market for it? And are the economics going to work? And so what people often do is work on the technology problem, then they say, oh, now let's see how we market it. And then finally they say, well, is it going to pay enough to make this viable? You've got to work on all three problems in parallel. So I'm answering a question about for people who want to become entrepreneurs, I think. I'm not answering that question for people who want to stay in the academic world. But if they want to stay in the academic world, I think the same thing applies. What are going to be the big problems? Because of the very specialized nature of the way in which we now build knowledge, you get very narrow very quickly, and you just follow your nose, and you might be going down a very dark tunnel with no end. So I think you have to step back and say, okay, well, I know what's cool today, but what are the big problems of tomorrow, and how do I get to tackle them?
Okay, with that, I hope this talk has given some of you guys, the audience, some ideas about what might be the big problems in the future. So I believe it is time now to draw this interview to a close. Professor Barker, thank you ever so much for coming to talk to us today and offering so generously your thoughts on such a broad range of topics. We went from discussing the pandemic all the way to AI and how that can be applied in medicine, and just to innovation in general. And thank you for your advice at the very end. I hope all our audiences have taken away something from this past hour, I think. Thank you so much for coming here today and listening to us having this discussion. Thank you to our committee members for keeping everything running. And I look forward to seeing you next week, where we'll have Professor Scott Aronson from UT Austin talking about quantum computing. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks. Bye-bye.